And so welcome to Just Festival and to this very special event by Peace and Justice Scotland, Never Again Louder Than Bombs. My name is Helen and I'm Festival Director. Just Festival is Edinburgh's Arts, Human Rights and Interfaith Festival. And through our festival each year, we bring together speakers, performers and audiences to discuss key issues facing us as a society. We're celebrating our 21st anniversary this year with a really special live and online programme. And this is one of the events that I've been really looking forward to. Our programme partners for this event, Peace and Justice Scotland, is one of 468 partner organisations that collectively make up the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN, who were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017 for their work to promote the ban treaty. So I'd like to welcome our presenters this evening, Peter Kennard, one of Britain's most influential political artists who's created many iconic images for anti-nuclear campaigns, ones that we will all recognise, and Kate Hudson, General Secretary of CND, who will facilitate this evening's conversation. So before we start, let me take you through a little bit of housekeeping. This evening's event is a webinar, which means that you won't be able to see or hear the rest of the audience, but we do very much want you to comment and ask questions for our panel this evening. If you have a look at your menu bar at the bottom of the screen, you will find the Q&A button. Click that and please send us any of your questions and comments and we'll respond to them as we go through the evening. Please note the event is being recorded, so if you do want to comment, you may comment anonymously if you prefer. The event will last approximately 1 hour and towards the end I'll be gathering your questions and your comments as we go along. And I'll pop into the chat with about 15 minutes to spare to give a time check. And that's the chance for you, the question that's burning in the back of your mind that you really want to ask, that's your last chance to do it. Okay, so I really am looking forward to this event. So welcome all again, and thank you for attending. And a huge thanks to our speakers this evening on behalf of Just Festival. So Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Helen, and thank you to Just Festival for hosting this discussion. I want to give a very special thank you to the organisers of the Peace Cranes installation. Unfortunately, because of COVID and all work and everything, I haven't been able to actually get up to Scotland to see it. But from what I've seen online, it just looks absolutely amazing. And I think for me, the fact that it's exploring not only nuclear weapons, the threat of nuclear weapons, but also the ecological emergency. I think that's for me, that's the really serious fact, because it couldn't be more timely and appropriate. For CND, of course, these twin threats are very much in our mind, not least because for 2 years now in a row, the hands of the doomsday clock, that is the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in the US, they set the hands closer or further to midnight, midnight being annihilation of everything we know and love. It's been 100 seconds to midnight, the closest it's ever been, even during the Cold War. And the scientists have set it at that for precisely this reason, not only because of the threat of nuclear war, which was the originating reason, but also now because of the climate catastrophe. So I think we're all really very much on the same page, and certainly CND is embracing the climate issue and the ecological sustainability campaigning as well. But for the purposes of our conversation this evening, the question is, yes, those facts are out there. Many people are cottoning onto them, but how do we really change minds? And can art be a way of changing minds? And so I can't think of anyone better to discuss this with than Peter Kennard, who's, I can see there, in a very interesting studio there, Peter. Obviously, I know you most through your work for the peace movement, and usually we've talked about the 1980s and so on, because that's when I came into the picture as an activist and when I first got to know your work. But how did you get involved in C&D in the first place? Was it much before that, or was that really, was the 80s the start for you too?
Well, I actually started in 79 when cruise missiles were announced. They didn't arrive straight away, but that's when Thatcher announced that they were going to be there. So I wanted to do something, about it. It was the beginning of C&D actually growing. When I first went to C&D, it was a tiny little room in Holborn, I seem to remember, and everyone was just sitting on the floor. And then, of course, in the next 2 years, it grew into a massive movement. It was very quick sort of development because it had been a bit sort of moribund in the 70s. But it was cruise missiles that galvanized us all to do something. So I went along there and discovered that, I mean, I really like working with people that aren't sort of in the art world, or that those sort of people. When you're working with people who are actually involved in movements, they're much more critical and they're much more direct about what they're seeing in the work, and they're seeing it in a way of thinking how is this going to communicate to people directly. And so I started making work for C&D, and then just taking it along. It was totally informal relationship. I just would make something and then take it in, and people would sit around and tear it and verbally tear it apart or not, depending on. So it was, which is great. So it's that sort of thing of debate and discussion with people that are active in the movement. And I think art is political. When you talk about political art, I don't think art in itself changes the world. It's when it's allied to a movement. I think. That's what I've always tried to do, is actually be involved in activism in relation to different political and social movements and NGOs and charities, and that's the way for the work to get out to people in the streets. So it's not just a sort of gallery-based thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Your image, obviously when I first saw it, I didn't know it was you, but that kind of, it was just everywhere. The C&D symbol with the broken missile through it, that kind of sums it up and says it all. I was quite interested in what you were saying just then about how C&D had become kind of moribund in the 1970s, because in its kind of first wave, like late 50s and in early 60s, it's spoken of as if it was a kind of like the first radical social movement. And I always had that there were lots of jazz musicians and all that on the Older Marston marches, and a kind of bit of a flowering of intellectual life around it, and so on. So were there any images that came out of that early period that you think kind of caught people's eye?
Well, of course, Gerald Holton, who designed the peace symbol, which is now the C&D symbol of peace, that was in 1958. He designed it. So he was a really political graphic designer. He was great, and never really got recognised till much later for that work. But I always think that, like, the Committee of 100, which was the group of people who sat down in Downing Street in the days you could get into Downing Street, and were carried away. That involved quite a lot of artists. People like Gustav Metzger, who was a great political artist, were involved in the Committee of 100. And there had been there was a group called the AIA, the Artists International Association, which went back to it went back to the post-war period, and it had enormous number of artists were involved in it, and it was an anti-fascist sort of movement. It was after the war, and it was to get artists together to produce, and they did produce sort of floats and things for demonstrations, all that. So and it had people like Henry Moore involved in it, and I think he was also involved in CND. So artists have been involved in different ways in Britain with movements, but they don't often get then seen by the art world as artists. I mean, the sort of work that I do, you know, it's only in the last few years it's actually been. It's if you're too political in the art world, if you're too specifically political, then it's dodgy, because people see that as being propaganda. In England, very much, and not so much in places like Germany. It's got a great tradition of political culture and political art, you know, Brecht and Hartfield and all those people. In this country, it's a bit different.
Yeah, I think you must have broken through that kind of divide in a way, because isn't your title at the Royal College of Art Professor of Political Art? Yeah, so maybe they created that specially for you.
Well, they did. That was their idea. I don't know who it's going to follow on from me when I leave it, but
you mentioned Hartfield there, Peter, the German artistic movement and so on. I can see we've got a comment from Heather Kiernan in the Q&A, if I could just read that out so we can have a little reflect on that. Hi, Peter. We normally think of photomontage being used by artists on the left as a means of political protest, Hartfield, Gross, and the Russian constructivists. But it has been appropriated by the right, says Heather, the futurists, Dali, Cocteau, and of course Gilbert and George. So in the age of Trump and Fox News, shouldn't we be worried that the right will use art as propaganda? What do you think of that?
Right, that's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think any medium in itself can be sort of left wing or right wing. It's what you do with it. I don't think montage in itself, you know. I mean, obviously, it's been used a lot by advertisers, and you know, the Tory party used it when they, with Saatchi and Saatchi did when they were doing their advertising. So it's just a medium that can be used, but when it's used on the left, it's obviously it's about exposing something that's hidden in our society and hidden in capitalist media, and you know, and with montage you can actually join the you know, the victims of a war with the image of the president who's actually directing the war. You can join things up that are usually separate. So there is an inherent critique in the possibilities of what you can do with montage, but I think everything. I think everything can be taken in, and you know, it's that thing of capitalism can actually take everything in and use it, like it does, say, with street art. You know, like Nike now gets street artists to graffiti their adverts because it makes it cool. So everything can be used. So one of the things with montage is that usually the critique is so strong that it's very difficult for it to be used by the opponents. I mean, it's happened with some of my stuff. I mean, there was an image I did for CND that went on to the cover, and it was used in a demonstration. Someone photographed it. They'd made it was a sculpture of one of my images that someone had made, and then it was used as a cover of the Economist magazine. But underneath it said, I can't remember what the actual headline, but basically, you know, these crazies are out there in the streets doing this, and because they're totally pro nuclear weapons, as the Economist, or they were that. So you can appropriate, you know, they can appropriate your images. as well. So that's, you know, there's obviously once you make an image, it goes out into the world, it can go into lots of strange directions.
Talking of, I mean, you talking about capitalism there, you know, in relation to art and so on, and you also talked about street art and so on. I mean, it seems that the drive to kind of marketization of all forms of art, I mean, it's gone a bit crazy, hasn't it? You know, where people kind of peel off a whole wall, you know, because it's got a Banksy on it or something like that, selling the piece of wall, or kind of peeling off the plaster or whatever to get this thing to be able to sell it.
Yeah.
And the latest, I mean, I don't even totally get it, but the kind of digital art thing at the moment, you know, where now you can make a work of art a non-fungible token. Well, not a work of art, a digital work of art, a non-fungible token, i.e. something that it's like kind of provenance via the blockchain to show that you are the person who owns the original digital piece of art. I mean, isn't that seems to me to be a bit crazy? Because isn't one of the good things about the digital era that we can all see and share these things anyway? So if you're kind of, wasn't it Beeple or somebody, you know, $60 million for some digital image? I mean, what's your take on that, Peter?
Well, I must say, I don't quite understand it. I mean, I think it's basically, it's like the image becomes a piece of Bitcoin that is then rare as the image that's been through all the computer systems that create the Bitcoin. So in that sense, it's not the image itself that's of value. It's the fact that it's part of a economic system, you know, an alternative economic system, which is Bitcoin. I mean, which is another question if that is more ethical than the you know, the straight way of making money. But so because most of the work is that people are putting up on those for those NFT non-fungible tokens is absolute crap. You know, the actual images are just nothing.
Yeah, someone's tweet was sold, wasn't it? For like millions of dollars.
But I mean, the art world itself has become this. It's a monstrous thing where there's a big connection between the sale rooms and the curators and the patrons. And the fact is that as public money is taken out of the arts, they all have to get sponsored. You know, they get sponsorship from commercial, from companies, from corporations, and corporations sponsorship does come with strings attached. It's not. It doesn't. You know, they love a thing that's got an edge to it that looks like, you know, the sort of generalized about birth, copulation, and death. You know, like Damien Hirst or something. But anything that's specific that is aimed in any way is you know, they won't finance it. So the actual public art is quite limited in what the art world will show, because it has to fit into this quite corporate. It's an enormously corporate scene now, contemporary art. You know. They have about 100 artists whose work is really valuable, and then the rest, then there's a big gap. It's a sort of microcosm of society where the rich are getting richer and richer, like they have done during COVID, and the poor are getting poorer and poorer. You know, that gap is reflected in the art world as well.
Absolutely. We've got another question from Robert, but Robert, I think we need to see some of Peter's work first before we come on to that question, if you don't mind. Peter, will you share some of your images with us?
Yeah, I've got some posts. I think I've got the first one I should show. It should be because it's in Scotland. It is the Firth of Clyde.
Oh wow!
Yeah, which sort of speaks for itself, I hope. But the thing about that one is it's actually using a postcard, an actual postcard, and then cutting in, and that's what I mean about an image being, you know, it's revealing what's hidden from the surface, what's underneath it. And here it's just cut into the middle where there was another photograph for the Firth of Clyde. So that was a.
When did you do that? When did you do that?
That was a good question. I think about 1983. That one.
All right.
Yeah. I mean, they were at that time.
They were already up there, weren't they? The nuclear subs were already up in the cloud.
Yeah, they were up there. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's horrific. And this one, which is because we're speaking on 76th anniversary of Hiroshima, the bombing of Hiroshima. So this is it's labeled. You probably can't read it, but Hiroshima at the time and the date of Hiroshima and the time and the date of Nagasaki underneath, and then never again. And the original impetus for doing these things was that the actual suddenly there were a lot of anti-nuclear books being written. This was in the 80s, but the covers were just straight photographs of the nuclear cloud, and the nuclear cloud was also a best-selling poster from a somewhere called Athena that used to have poster shops, and they just got this big air crush with no words on it. It was just like a. So the fact is, the images of nuclear weapons had become normalized, totally normalized, and they weren't actually connecting death and they were connecting Hiroshima with the image. So I made this image, and again with montage, I saw that the plume of the nuclear cloud would connect straight into a skeleton. So it's the thing one's looking for an image like that. It is a sort of actual connection. It's not just a collage of random bits.
What kind of response did that get at the time?
Well, it's difficult to judge. I mean, it's always, some of my things have had very, depending on where people are politically as well. I mean, I did one of Britain being encased in a CND symbol. I haven't actually got an image of it here, but CND put it out as a cover of a leaflet, and it was taken on by it was given away free, and then a group called the Coalition for Peace Through Security, which was a totally anti-CND group, very right-wing group, which had named Hogg in it, who became a minister in the Tory. Anyway, they decided to reprint that image, and they put a hammer and sickle on top of it. So CND wanted me to go to court on copyright. We weren't going to go on to talk about the hammer and sickle, because that would have been an expensive, complicated thing. It's just that they used my image, and anyway, we went to the Old Bailey, which was quite an event, and it ended up with the judge saying that they didn't consider my work was a work of art because there wasn't enough thought process involved in it.
What a cheek!
That's great. So he sat there on his stage with his wig on and doing an art critique from the upper classes, and we lost the case, So, yeah, they said because mine wasn't a work of art, it didn't matter that they'd nicked it.
That's terrible, isn't it? So, I hope you didn't have to pay a lot for the case.
It did cost something, yeah. And like this one, which is probably one which is sort of lasted. Probably people know.
That's the riff on the hay wain, isn't it?
Hay wain, which is and that's become a sort of that was because of Greenham, because when the government decided to use Greenham to have cruise missiles, they sent out a leaflet to people living in the area saying, don't worry about these missiles. And their actual words were, they'll melt into the countryside, which I thought was rather wonderful.
Oh, yes.
As the people will be melting. Anyway, they illustrated it with a watercolor, which is a traditional medium of the sort of English art, to show the sort of beauties of the countryside and the rural country, so that inspired me to take the Helen, which is the most well-known image of the well-known painting of the British countryside, and then just dump the missiles on top of it, I used a photograph from the National Gallery where the painting is, and I thought it, which is sort of copyright, but I didn't hear anything for about 10 years, and then they contacted me. I thought, oh, well, they're a bit slow, and they said to me, oh yeah, we wanted to use your picture in a lecture about Constable. Is that all right? So
that's brilliant. So yeah, you mentioned Greenham there, Peter. It's the 40th anniversary this year, and I think it's like the first weekend in September. There's going to be kind of various events going on, and I think there's a march of women coming from Wales again to Greenham to commemorate it. There's going to be events and so on. I mean, what kind of impact do you think the peace camp stuff, and particularly the women's peace camp, what kind of impact did that have on ideas at the time and attitudes?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's the most influential protest that of the last 40 years, because its influence has gone right up to Occupy. When Occupy was at St. Paul's and in the States and in different countries, that whole thing of being there, of living the protest rather than just going out to a demonstration and coming back, but you actually live the protest is really important, and hopefully that it'll happen again. But that all goes back to Greenham. And one of the things they did, at weekends, they invited everybody who wanted to go down to come down, and it had an 8-mile perimeter fence, and inside were the concrete silos with the cruise missiles, and you couldn't see the missiles. It's just these horrific bland silos. And so everybody put stuff on this fence. So there were paintings, there was tapestries, embroidery, there was corn that was sort of weaved into the fence. So you got this amazing juxtaposition of all this humanity that put all this beautiful work up. I mean, literally I think it was 8-mile perimeter, and then inside was the horrors and the madness of nuclear weapons. And I always think that's a great work of art, that green fence. I mean, I always regret, and I've never found out if it was actually photographed and archived. I don't know, but that sort of creativity is something that was incredibly, as well as the women living there, the way they did it in terms of the mediums they used, in terms of their ways of protesting, is something that's influenced movements ever since. And it's influenced, when you CND demonstrations where people have made their own placards and all that sort of thing. There's a tradition there, and to me, it's part of a tradition of protest art. And now, often museums are collecting these placards and things. You see them at the end of demonstrations, or these curators going around picking up placards, which I think is great because it means that stuff is kept.
There's been some incredibly creative ones around the recent protests, particularly Black Lives Matter, for example, marvellous homemade placards. So I'm very glad that they're being collected. I know that the V&A has a really fantastic protest archive, doesn't it? I think they did an exhibition protest recently. But just going back to the thing about the kind of work, the kind of women's kind of cultural product, let's say, at Greenham. I don't know if you know, but a few years ago, inspired by the Greenham thing, some women, there was one woman in particular called, I think her name was Jane, I can't remember her surname, had the idea of knitting, joining up Aldermaston and Burfield, you know, the two nuclear weapons factories, joining them up with a long pink knitted scarf. And so over the course of like a year or something, women and men knitted panels of, you know, pink wool, or, you know, nice shades of pinky type wool. And they were eventually all sewn together in sections. And then the sections were kind of put together and held by women between Aldermaston and Burfield. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
We used some of it a few months later to surround the Ministry of Defence with a pink wool scarf kind of thing, using some of the panels for this. But it reminded me, and we touched on it when we were chatting before, how often kind of things that women make, you know, traditionally that women make, like things like knitting, weaving, crocheting, and so on, they're kind of defined as kind of craft, as if they're a kind of lower level than high art, which men do primarily. I mean, does that distinction break down, you know, in terms of art and protest, or is it breaking down more generally, would you say?
Well, it is. I mean, in the art world, it's in the curatorship in the art world, in terms of women's art being shown more like at the Tate, is about 50-50 now, of male and female artists. And they've got an exhibition at the moment, Sophie Tolber-Arp, who made wonderful tapestries as well as paintings. You know, so that it is the male canon, which has been, you know, from Cézanne to Jackson Pollock, that sort of canon is being exploded. I mean, it is being broken down in terms of women artists, in terms of artists of color, and whose work has always, you know, been sidelined as women's work is. I mean, women's work is still, it doesn't sell for as much in the sale rooms, but that's that side, that's the blue chip art world. But there are very good curators within these places who are actually breaking down a lot of these established norms of, you know, like you're saying, Kate, you know, of saying people make tapestries as not being as high up the art tree as if you're making a painting. That is breaking down. But I mean, it has been completely the sort of art world. The canon was created by the Museum of Modern Art in America, basically, and it's all white male, mainly Western, all Western artists, and that's being exploded because the times we're living in are so vital in terms of the struggle, you know, like Black Lives Matter. The art is sort of tail ending it in some ways, but it is changing.
Actually, funnily enough, I mean, there's a whole thing on telly nowadays, which is quite good, I think, of academics who are presenting TV programs to popularize their particular bit of, you know, whether it's science or history or art or whatever. I mean, I quite enjoy some of them. But what I've become aware of, probably through some programs like that, is how many artists, women artists, there actually were in Renaissance times, for example. You know, at the same time as Titian and Raphael and people like that, there actually are these women artists of note, you know, who, and their works are in museums, but you just never really hear about them.
The work's been buried, and there's just been that show of I can never pronounce her name, Gentileschi.
Gentileschi, is it?
Gentileschi, yeah. Is an amazing artist, and her work is actually about male oppression. A lot of it, she was actually raped when she was a young woman, and the work is so strong. But that work was never, like when I did art history at college, it was never mentioned, any of that work. And if you were like political and a woman, you were doubly silenced in that sense. I mean, I don't know, there's an article, Hannah Harper, who did wonderful collages and things. His work was never, it was always seen as being very sidelined. It was never actually being seen within the art movement of Dada, which he was part of. And that's changed in the last 15 years, you know. It's part of the struggle, it's part of the feminist struggle in that sense, is the culture has to change.
Have you got any more posters there for us, Peter? And then we can look at a couple more questions and also to talk about your ecological work and so on as well.
Yeah, I've got some more. I mean, it's definitely the same period. We're talking about Greenham, that's one.
Oh, fantastic. Just Cruise.
That's if women hadn't been there. I mean, the thing is about the women's peace camp as well, it actually had an effect, didn't it? I mean, you know, in terms of getting rid of those things. And so this is if maybe if they hadn't been there, just cruising. I mean, you know, they always call these missiles by nice anodyne names, that we're just going on a cruise, you know, which is equal to the cruise missile. One cruise missile is equal to about 18 Hiroshimas, I think. Some cruise, so that's another thing of taking something that everybody knows. It's one of the things with this sort of work, because one's working against the whole corporate world of advertising, which has enormous hoardings and whatever. And of course, doing this sort of work, you don't have much money, so an A3 poster, it's got to come through really fast, because one is competing in that sense. And then the broken missile one, I thought this is the picture where, I don't know if you can see who's next to Nicola Sturgeon there.
There I am.
So I put that one in, but it shows the use of that broken missile one.
Yeah, that was the 2016 demo, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, so that was one of the original uses of it. That was an A2 poster.
Oh yeah, Protest and Survive. That's fabulous, isn't it?
And then later, when it was 2016, when it went through Parliament again, it's the same image.
That was the post. We had those up on the tube in London, you know, massive.
Yeah, I know. Ones, I went on the tube. That was great. But I mean, it's an amazing thing that we do something and we're still in exactly the same situation with it as we were then. So it's very much. I mean, it's great that it's still being used, but it's not great that we've still got.
No.
And we're actually spending another 40% of the budget is going to go on more weaponry, isn't it?
Yeah, 40% increase in the arsenal. But look, Peter, that's still a completely contemporary image.
Yeah, well, that's what's horrific about it. I mean,
know it's horrific, but it's great. You know, for campaigning purposes, it's great.
And then there's another photo I've got here of it's got the thing up behind me, which is
look, Climate Not Trident.
Yeah, which is
a fantastic thing.
So that was the last time. That was in October 2000. When was it? October 2019. Just so it was before lockdown. That was the kind of school strikes and so on, wasn't it? And this was an Extinction Rebellion on Westminster Bridge. Over the bridge, which is now, of course, it's going to be illegal with the Criminal Justice Bill.
Yeah.
But I made this thing montage, and then there's a slightly weird performative thing. I stood behind it, and I had a lot of holes in it, and then poked this sort of plastic hose thing, and then it dripped. So all this is dripping down to make the connection between oil and war. It wasn't actual oil; it was molasses
Right. That brings us neatly on, Peter, too, because I've just got my eye on the clock, and I think probably Helen's going to whiz back in a minute and tell us we haven't got much time left. But in 2011, I was very fortunate to go to the Tate Gallery for the launch of this fantastic little book. It's not showing very well because of my screen. Yeah, At Earth.
Yeah.
You taking on the whole climate change issue, and it dovetails with another question from Heather in the chat. She says, "I understand, Peter, that you are planning an exhibition later this year that speaks to the threat and echoes the exhibition you were part of with students of the RCA back in 2015 in the run-up to COP21. And of course, now we're in the run-up to COP26, aren't we? I mean, how's it going with kind of generating, young artists and so on to be working around this issue?"
Yeah, but there's a lot of work being made by artists about climate, and which is great. I mean, there is that total involvement of young people in the questions of climate, and but some of the work is quite conceptual in the sense that it's within the realms of a sort of art that you really need a background in art to fully get. So the sort of things that I do, I mean, they're much more obvious in that sense. But I very much wanted to make the connection between, the twin threats of nuclear weapons and climate change. I mean, there's even a factual connection. Is that the biggest corporate user of oil in the States is in the world. In fact, the biggest corporate user of oil is the US military. Millions of barrels a year of oil are used in the making of all the horrific weapons, as well as the propagation of them around the world. And so there's that actual physical connection. So, which I think it's important to point out, and I think that's happening. It's bringing people into the questions of nuclear weapons, because I think there is that thing with nuclear weapons that they're not. There's a lot of amazing campaigners who've been campaigning against them for years, and still being arrested for it. But getting young people involved in that question is quite difficult, I think. But I think that making that connection between climate and nuclear weapons is really vital.
Yeah, I know that. Hello, Helen. Are you telling us we've got?
Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt you, and I'm just popping in terms of a time check. And we have one more question in the Q&A, and I would also like to ask a question of Peter, if that's possible. So I'll do that when you're just about finishing your point there. I interrupted you.
No, okay, that's okay. I mean, I was just going to say that with COP26 coming up, Peter, that this is the real opportunity, isn't it, to raise these issues. And I know that campaigners in Scotland in particular, and Scottish CND and others that they work with, are really making the connection between what you were saying about militarism and the carbon footprint of the military and the nuclear weapons industry and all that together. I know that that's something that they are going to really be raising in the context of COP26. And Heather mentioned an exhibition. I mean, are you doing something around that?
Yeah, I'm doing something at a place called Street Level in Glasgow during COP. If it happens for real, we still don't definitely know. It's not going to be virtual, but I think it will happen for real. So I'm going to do an exhibition and do stuff hopefully in the street, which will be like take work out and post it up, and there's going to be lots of demonstrations, obviously, but there's a lot of creativity going on in terms of what people are thinking about. So I think that's really, it's going to be a center for demands, real demands, which is what we've got to do. I mean, it's, you know, yeah.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a comment from Margaret. This is in response to our discussion around knitting and so on, and weaving and that. Margaret Ferguson Burns, she says, there is currently a project, Stitches for Survival, 100 times 60 centimetre panels, mainly in greens and blues, knitted, crocheted, appliqued, quilted, felted, etc., illustrating ideas around the effect of a climate crisis on our natural environment, to be stitched together into a giant scarf to go to COP26 in Glasgow in November. How fantastic.
Right.
Brilliant, Margaret, that is amazing. And then, so what I suggest we do, we take Robert's question, and then we'll take Helen's question, and that might neatly take us through to our time. Does that sound okay? So Robert Ray, thank you for your patience. He says, it seems that left-wing artists are finding refuge in academia. Well, I didn't know there was any left-wing people left in academia, but I may be wrong, which are becoming more and more commercial in their outlook. Is there a worry that left-wing art is being neutralised or distanced from social movements by its absorption into higher education? What do you think of that, Peter?
That's an interesting angle on it. I mean, you know, I've been criticised. I mean, I've been working at Royal College about 25 years. I'm about to retire, I think. But I mean, art schools, especially, and are places where artists have always been able to make a living, or to go towards making a living. You know, I mean, we're all on. I do 2.5. I'm on 0.5, 2.5 days a week. So I don't think it's neutralized by being a teaching it. I think it can be the opposite, that you actually involve students in thinking about their work in relation to what's going on in the world, rather than in a self-enclosed art world. And you know, I think what's happening, especially in America, is that a lot of left-wing theorists and campaigners are being chucked out of universities, and it's beginning to happen here as well. They're not taking anybody radical in, because you know there is a great fear of the power of culture. I mean, to me, art is becoming more and more important, because it's a place where people can actually make a critique of what's going on in the world, when everything is so corporate. You know, all the media is so corporate, all the streets are getting more and more privatized. So art has become more and more important, and that to me is one of the reasons why the Tories have now cut the budget to the arts, the government budget to the arts, by 50%, because they don't like the sort of freedom of and the thinking that goes on inside art schools, which are now part of universities. So I don't see that it's being neutralized. I think it's always been vitally, especially art schools, been vitally important. You know, so many sort of radical ideas have come out of art schools in terms of music and you know, all forms of culture, not just visual art. They've been oasis for people that don't fit into straight society, and they've gone off to do all different things. So I don't see people that are, say, making their living from teaching in university. I don't see that as a negative thing. I think, you know, one of the points originally of universities was the dissemination of knowledge, and you know, and now it's a whole question of what's become of the universities and what's becoming of them.
Yes, I've heard from friends who work in universities, that there's a kind of almost a stifling of what they feel able to say now, that they have to, really be careful. And that's bad, because as you say, at their best, higher education and universities and so on are supposed to be there for ideas, development of ideas, exposing people to knowledge and so on, not a fixed canon, but to be able to develop those ideas in so many ways. So, we need to defend that, I think. I mean, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do.
So, okay, Helen, give us your question.
I think it's just very much in relation to what you're talking about in terms of the universities. And I suppose my comment, you're talking about, young people being really energized by the environment crisis and really finding a way to collectivize in some way around that kind of movement and campaign. And with young people, though, I'm thinking about, in art college, the pipeline to art college, as we know, and the pipeline to higher education, particularly art college, is very much for the middle class. We know that the kind of the shift of the kind of demographic of students is changing massively. Working class students are not seeing a career in the arts as an option anymore, as the kind of public money is sucked out of arts education, sucked out of, well, not just the education, but actually then how do you continue a career after you have your education? So it's being sucked out of actually the presentation of all of that. And my background isn't in visual art, it's in theatre. So I'm kind of, but there is definitely a correlation there. And I suppose it's, slightly related to what Robert was saying, is that, so in 10 years' time, where are the tutors like you? In 10 years' time, those students who've come through art college, who have found themselves actually working more in a business model than a knowledge exchange model, they're the ones who are going to be teaching a kind of very privileged and narrow demographic of young people. So where do the artists who want to make a living in a political context, do we need to find an alternative route for those artists to be able to make a living and find a way for people to sustain careers in different ways?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, it's true what you're saying. I mean, if you make political, the sort of work I do anyway, you don't expect to make a living out of it, because most of it is unpaid, obviously, for movements, and they haven't got any, they haven't got money to pay. But in the past, there have been enough ways to sort of negotiate different things. But like you say, the people they're taking on now, I know art schools are taking on people that are able to manage. They want sort of managers in that sense, rather than working artists, and that's really problematic. And
I mean, there's the sort of consciousness, sorry to interrupt you, were saying the consciousness about that, shifting the canon around, around gender or around ethnicity and around it, but class isn't being addressed as strongly.
I mean, I know that where I don't know Royal College, you don't get working class students and you don't get them applying now, because they've got massive that's for MA, because they've got massive loans for their BA. So that has affected the whole class basis of art schools, and it's almost going back to it was, pre-war. Because I mean, that changed. Like when I went to art school, I could get a grant. I got a grant, and life was different as well, because I could squat and things like that. There was a sort of we haven't been so sort of taken over in the sense that we are now. So and it was possible to do it. And then a lot of people that did it, they didn't, if they didn't teach afterwards, they found ways of making a living and continuing to make work. So that is that is very, very difficult now. I mean, you know, it's a struggle. That's why I think, you know, it's necessity that's made a lot of younger artists now sort of work much more collectively, and which is really great that they're doing that. But it's also, you know, it's come out of necessity, and there's really rich sort of groups who are, I mean, rich in ideas, not in financially, but rich in ideas of young people who are coming together from different disciplines as well. You know? So and I think that might be why so many people are looking towards the 70s and 80s, when there were a lot of different collectives, and, you know, women's art collectives and photography collectives and all those things, because we're almost, you know, going back to that time now, but it was easier to do it at that time in that sense. And it's quite,
let's hope the age of individualism is fading, Peter, you know, and we've had it too much for the last 30 or 40 years, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Helen, it's our time up.
I think time's up. Yes. I was just getting into a stride and was just about to open a bottle of wine there, and it's just for the rest of the evening. That would be really nice. But listen, so thank you very much on behalf of Just Festival. It's been really lovely to listen, and, you know, I just find it very heartening, and especially when people join through in the conversations, that there is actually, you're talking about a collective, and there is a sort of sense of an awakening of a sense of collective somewhere. And I think your art, you know, finds a way that people can kind of orientate around. I mean, that we often get all these questions around, well, you know, you're talking to the converted, and you know, what's the point and all this kind of thing. But actually, you know, the affirmation, the sense of collective purpose around an image, you know what I mean, that kind of brings people together in a way that kind of creates great strength. And so I really want to thank you for all your work, and yeah, anchoring people to what's really matter and what really important. And Kate, thank you so much for facilitating the conversation, and bringing your great knowledge and your extensive history. And I remember Greening Common very well. So thank you very much indeed. And we'll close with a goodbye to our audience. And we'll
thanks.
See you all again. Have a look at the rest of the programme for Just Festival. And we do have other conversations that you may find very, very interesting and aligned with this subject. Thank you now. Good night.
Bye. Goodbye.
Bye.